I think we can all agree that the hardest act to follow is in fact lunch. So I'm going to try my best to pump up the energy for this afternoon session. Also, before I forget, I don't know whether I'm allowed to do this, but shout out to M7, who I know are watching on the live stream. So I'm Alex Rühl, and I am, well, I'm a few different things. I'm a VR director. I do a lot of corporate and commercial work. I'm a producer, I run a production studio, Cats and Not Peas, and we do a lot of original IP and run VR for Good programs. And most recently, I became a curator. So today I want to talk about my experience bringing Cinematic 360 to public audiences. Now, there's a title that I've had a lot longer than any of these titles that I think makes me a little bit more qualified and interested in talking about this subject, and that's one that I've had since I was a kid. This is me, 8 years old, dressed up as Xena the Warrior Princess. And like most kids, I had a ridiculously overactive imagination. I used to run around the house pretending that I was Xena, imagining myself in the world, in the stories, and I genuinely thought that I was a character in this TV show. I would kind of create storylines and interact with the characters, and I would properly immerse myself in these worlds. And the first time that I experienced VR was the first time that I ever had a taste of what it would actually be like to get to step into that kind of fictitious space. And so that led me down a bit of a rabbit hole, and fast forward to 2017, I released my first 360 drama, Key to Like. And this was really an experiment in how can I use this technology to kind of bring characters to life, to immerse you in a kind of a drama. And it was interesting. It was an interesting experience. It got licensed by Jaunt, RIP, and it did the festival circuit. And what I found was the experience didn't really kind of hit with the VR kind of industry. This film is not by any means a technical feat. It's a single monoscopic shot for 7 continuous minutes. It's not about the technology at all. It's all about the characters. And I really wanted to kind of bring this to public audiences because I thought I want to see what kind of the everyday kind of person would think of this. And so I partnered with my local independent cinema, The Phoenix in Leicester, back in the UK. And we were like, let's just put it on. Let's just kind of rent the headsets. Let's see if there's an audience for this. And so we rented 20 gear VRs and we put it out, put the word out. And lo and behold, people showed up to kind of experience this new way of kind of seeing a film, of seeing something cinematic. And the stories and the discussions that kind of came out of those showings was genuinely the most fulfilling thing that I'd ever done in my career up until that point. So much so that the Phoenix really kind of believed that there was a market for this in the traditional cinema landscape. And so they went after funding from the BFI, the British Film Institute in the UK, and they agreed to fund a six-month VR cinema integrated properly into the cinema program, which was the first of its kind in the country, which was really, really exciting. I don't know, what it's like in other countries around the world, but in the UK, it's absolutely split between kind of high concept art that is funded by the Arts Council, and then game, which is kind of funded by different bodies. And there's no in-between space. There's no one really focusing on funding story-led, cinematic, specifically 360 content. And so when they asked me to curate this and to kind of host these cinemas and see if we could bring VR, I guess, to the masses, VR films, I obviously said yes. And so that led to a 6-month strand of VR cinemas where we put roughly about 1,000 people through these kind of pop-up strands. And it was really important to me. I wanted to use it I was a bit selfish, and I wanted to use it as a bit of a test bed for what kind of content audiences were actually engaging with. I thought this is perfect. It's funded R&D, they just don't know it. And so I curated quite a kind of wide array of content, 360 specifically, in different genres, so documentary, cultural pop, kind of interactive, drama, CGI-based stuff, live action stuff, volumetrically captured and then made 360 stuff, just a real kind of array. And I'm going to share with you some of the things that I kind of learned and the kind of feedback that we got from those 6 months. And so just quickly, though, the kind of setup for it, and I know Rachel kind of talked about this in her talk earlier, but we found that the best way to put this on, essentially, to make it kind of sustainable and manageable kind of with the small team that we had, was by doing about 10 headsets at a time. We had 13, so it could get slightly bigger, but we would usually run about 10 at a time. Swivel chairs, it sounds obvious, but when we first started this, we thought, you know what, we're trying to do something different. We're trying to bring this to cinema audiences. Let's put it on in the cinema. Let's make it feel like a proper cinematic event. And people hated it. People didn't like the fact that they couldn't turn around easily. People wanted a bit more extra space. They were conscious of the fact that they were sitting right next to each other. They wanted a bit more they wanted it to feel a bit more like, a kind of intimate event rather than kind of a few people dotted around a massive cinema screen. Sync software. So this is where the name of the presentation comes from. What can you see? So the main thing that we learned from showing Key to Like was that giving someone a VR headset and kind of teaching them how to use it on the day was a little bit like showing up at a cinema and them going, here's a film projector, here's how you work it. When you can do that, then you can watch the film. Enjoy! And we found that actually that was a bit of a barrier, and it stopped some people from wanting to come back because they felt that there was almost like this kind of, this technical kind of know-how that they needed. So we tried to make it as seamless as possible. We didn't want to spend loads of money by licensing, a platform like Showtime. So we actually built our own super simple sync software, which literally allowed us to just one click, and it worked. And priming expectations. So again, when you're dealing with like the public that have sometimes never even heard of VR, they've just seen something in the program and they've gone, that looks interesting, I'll go along to that. It's quite important that you kind of prime them for what they're about to experience, whether that be trigger warnings for the content, whether that be, even something as simple as saying, remember, this is 360, you can look around. It's amazing. In the beginning, when I didn't say that, at least a good third of the audience would just sit with a headset on, facing straight forward. And there was one woman that I remember saying, she came in late, so she hadn't heard me kind of say, oh, make sure you look around. And she she halfway through was saying that she'd been like just following characters with her eyes. And like one character started to walk off and she kind of like was like, oh, I could move. And she kind of discovered the fact that it was 360 that way, which I thought was really interesting. And she had that kind of, oh, wow moment. And content-wise, so we tried lots of different formats, longer content, shorter content, but back-to-back, shorter content and longer Q&A, that kind of thing. But what we thought was the sweet spot was about 12 to 20 minutes of content, packaged then with a Q&A afterwards. And that Q&A was so important. People, especially when they do VR for the first time, at 360 specifically, they want to be able to talk about it. They've had like this slightly transformational experience, and they want to be able to talk about that. So the audiences, again, this was very much aimed at a traditional independent cinema-going audience. So naturally, I didn't know this before, but naturally it kind of skews older and female, which I found really interesting because all of a sudden, I'd been working in VR for a while when I started this and mainly was interfacing with men. So to see kind of like lots of like older, kind of like my mum's age kind of coming along and trying VR, which was just brilliant. But again, not just age and gender, but kind of ethnicities, disabled kind of people who are able to come along, like lots of different people experiencing for the first time, which was great. The thing that kind of was the same amongst all of them, though, is they were all there because they were seeking a new experience. They weren't coming because they wanted to, have like a kind of a normal cinema experience. They wanted to come and experience something that they could go home and like shout about and kind of almost like brag about. I've had this really cool experience, like let me tell you about my VR experience. It's something that people want to be able to talk about, brag about a little bit. It's seen as quite like a cultural experience, which I know that everyone here, this is our day to day and we forget that, but it is quite special. We actually found that it was so special that we were getting repeat audiences by the end, so we ran it for 6 months. And by about 3 months in, at least kind of 50% of the audience of 50% of the showings were repeat audiences that were coming back every single month. And so that, again, kind of proves that there is this kind of, there is this big market for kind of cinematic VR. And the main thing in terms of, again, just a practical thing was no showings past 7:30. You'd think that, something like VR is kind of like an evening activity that you want to go out and do, with friends, or it's something you would see as maybe something that you would kind of like go out for as an event. Turns out, no, people don't want to kind of have a kind of active experience after 7:30. We found that between 5:30 and 6 till about 7 was about the sweet spot for getting sold out shows. So audience reactions, these kind of fell into 3 distinct kind of segments. And this was like across the board, and we kind of surveyed, and obviously we had the discussions after every single session. And so it was pretty much down the middle. Third audience is, oh my God, this is the future. Why is every film not like this? This is incredible, which is obviously music to all of our ears. Then you've got the middle segment, which is kind of like, I loved it, but I felt like I was missing something, like I felt like I couldn't get into the story because I was scared that there was something happening behind me. So much so, actually, that I'll tell you an anecdote from one of the screenings where the sync software kind of had a bit of a malfunction and one lady's headset didn't start, so we had to start hers manually. So we did it through Oculus Gallery, which I didn't know at the time replays content automatically. So everyone sat quietly, and I'm just like, she'll only be another minute. We only started it a minute afterwards. Just everyone sit quietly. Well, about 6 minutes passed, and we're like, I'm thinking, it's a bit rude to like go up to a stranger and kind of tap them and take their headset off. But I was thinking, like, this is definitely not right. Maybe she just sat in the menu. I'm not sure. Anyway, she takes the headset off, and she's like, oh, I watched it twice. I thought that was the point. I thought the point was that the first time I watched it, I could just follow the characters. And the second time I watch it, I can look wherever I want. And in the second viewing, she was saying that, in the first showing, like, she was really into the story, but then the second time, she was like taking in all the details. It was like a documentary, so she was kind of like really looking around at the landscape and the details on the wall, and she actually had a really lovely experience, which for me, like, was a bit of a crisis of like, is this how we should be showing all VR? Does that defeat the point of VR? Like, would she have paid to come back and seen it again if she hadn't watched it twice on the night? All these kind of interesting things. And then the third category, which was the pixel peepers. And generally speaking, this was people with already a bit of a technical know-how. They already kind of had a background, not necessarily in VR, but in technology. And these were the people that, were kind of interested in it, but these are the kind of people that were a bit like, well, the resolution's a bit crap, and maybe in the future when it's kind of, like photorealism and, we all know the types. And overall, kind of feeding back into the idea of the repeat audiences, what we found was that the more exposure someone had to VR, the higher their expectations became of the content, which as a curator is really hard because I'm kind of curating with a first-time audience in mind, but by the time someone's been for 6 months, the film that you can show them when they first start in VR is not going to impress them when they're 6 months down the road. So that's an interesting challenge for us as an industry, is to kind of think about, not only what kind of audience are we looking for our piece, niche-wise, but also how experienced is this person with VR? Are they the kind of person that, this is a public audience and this is the kind of person that's going to have never done VR before? Or is this the kind of person that's down the road, wants something a bit more spectacular, a bit more high-end kind of production, moving shots, that kind of thing? And so the feedback in general, so the discussions were really interesting. They kind of split into 2 camps, and there was no indication about why this was. There was nothing to do with kind of age or gender or, anything to do with statistics about what would lead to these different discussions. But generally speaking, the discussions either were all about the technology, wow, this was interesting, and what is the future of this technology, and how did you make this film, and what cameras were used, and like how is this even possible, and where is this going, or the subject matter, which to me was more interesting in the sense of when we showed U-Turn, which is a kind of a dark comedy about the kind of gender disparity in the tech industry. The whole conversation was dominated by gender equality, which was, again, really interesting because we're moving past the technology and we're talking about the actual subject itself. Live action over animation. In general, we showed about three pieces that were kind of live action, real people, 360, and then we showed about 3 pieces that were either integrated or purely animation or CGI. People preferred live action. They wanted to see real people, real places. That's what made them feel connected to the stories. This was a weird fact, people preferred the voyeuristic content. So I always thought, and going back to the analogy of me being Xena, I always liked the idea of being first person, of embodying a character, but people didn't like that. People preferred to kind of be following a character, but from a distance. They felt that it gave them the ability to kind of look around more because they kind of weirdly felt safe, that they weren't kind of, integral to the action. So that's quite an interesting fact in terms of kind of informing your creative process going forward, maybe something to consider. Documentaries over drama for a passive experience, and in terms of drama, they liked interactive, they wanted it to be personalized and maybe branch narrative, they wanted to be able to make choices as characters. In terms of like a cinematic audience, generally they preferred documentaries, which goes back to kind of, affirms what Rachel was saying earlier in her talk, generally speaking, and that could be because it's an independent cinema audience who kind of skew that way anyway, I'm not sure, but either way, that was overall, that was the kind of feedback we got. And so in terms of the business model, there is one, which is great news for all of us in this industry. It's not a massive moneymaker at this point, obviously. You have to have a lot of subsidized things. Obviously, we were lucky to have funding from the BFI. But in general, you can make money with something like this. And as a creator, that's really exciting because there is going to be, I believe, a marketplace down the road for location-based 360. Because I think that when you kind of have that kind of experience like this, it is the kind of thing that you want as a group, despite it being quite an intimate thing, an intimate experience. And so, the costs associated with it are the headsets. The cinema decided to buy the headsets outright rather than renting them every time, which I think was a good call. It allows them to get an ROI faster. Room hire, again, not a problem because the cinema were the ones putting on the event. But if you were to do this independently, maybe partnering with a venue that will give you a space for free is a really good idea. Licensing for the film. So one of the things that we were really passionate about is we want to pay these creators. Now, it's not a lot, but again, if you kind of did multiple of these, it would become lucrative. So a traditional feature film license fee for around a month, I think it is £125. So we were paying just under £100 for 2 showings for the 360 creators. And then we also tried to kind of bring as many of them in as possible to speak in these discussions and be part of that kind of event. And so they got paid a speaker's fee as well. But obviously, the barrier to this is you have to pay for a facilitator at the moment. So, I gave them a discount, but I didn't do it for free. I'm not a saint. So, you have to factor in the fact that this is obviously a specialized industry and we have a specialized skill set here. And so paying for that and paying for enough people to, to help facilitate. A friend of mine recently kind of shed light on the fact that running a VR cinema is much more like running a restaurant than it is to running a cinema in terms of the amount of people that you need in order to kind of to host it properly and to make sure people are looked after. So, I'm almost out of time, but forwarding on to kind of how this is informed in my kind of own creative practice, we previewed our latest piece, Playing God, which is an interactive 360 narrative at Cannes the other week. And what was quite interesting about that is it was kind of reaffirming to me that this is the way to go, and to actually bring it to public audiences is where I personally get the most fulfillment and informs kind of like the decisions that I'm making. This is obviously interactive, so I think that kind of having done the cinemas and realizing that actually personalization and interactivity and non-linear storytelling is definitely, I think, the future, especially for fiction-based pieces. And I just want to leave you on this beautiful picture again, because I just think that, you know, some of the people in this room have been doing this for decades. I've not been doing it that long, obviously. I was running around in paper armor 20 years ago, but I think that we all need to remember why we got into this, and one of the most fulfilling things about doing the cinema is seeing the passion and the kind of the spark of inspiration that people get when they do VR for the first time, which I think when you're down the road and you've been in it for a long time, you kind of forget why. And I'm hoping that one day one of you in here will invent the VR Xena. So anyway, we are going to be curating a permanent strand at the Phoenix in Leicester with the BFI's help. So if you've got content and you would like it to be considered for the cinema, then reach out to me on any of the social medias and I will get back to you. Thank you very much.
Right. Who has the first question?
I covered that much.
Thank you, Alex. Really good. It's all in Leicester at the moment. Are you planning on doing anywhere else in the country, or sticking to Leicester for the time being?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, I'm all over the place. So I've had talks about doing something similar in London. Obviously, I live in Leicester, so it's just easy for me to do that. But what I think is quite interesting now is we've established a business model for it. And, you know, because we've kind of captured the research and the kind of feedback from those audiences, it wouldn't be too difficult for us to kind of create that kind of business plan and start to kind of, not franchise it, but do you know what I mean? Kind of get it out there and allow other people to do it. But in terms of the BFI, I know that this is just the start. This is them kind of dipping their toe in the water. They're quite scared by it, I think. They're scared that this is a new industry they're going to have to start to understand. But I think the fact they are funding it is quite exciting and will, yeah, definitely lead to more of them.
Hey, thank you so much for the presentation. It's a little bit more a comment on the work, that I really like that the runtime of the show was a little bit longer. Uli and I experienced Tribeca Film Festival in New York, and they had a VR section in there, and it was next to impossible to get seats or tickets or anything, because the runtime was just basically a week. New York is a big city, so you have a large audience that are coming in for the film festival, and yeah, we basically got shuffled in through the back door, fortunately. The other people that would have been just sent away because there are no tickets available is like, can be really frustrating. I think the good takeaway here is let those run on a little bit longer, spend a little bit more time, give more show times for people to have a little bit more choice, and it gets less frustrating. So thank you for doing that.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I think that's one kind of slight failing, I think, of a lot of the festivals at the moment. And I think it's probably because I personally don't feel like they take 360 quite as seriously as the big installation pieces, because they want the installations to kind of draw the crowds in. But I totally agree. And I think that something like that has a knock-on effect. Like I've been annoyed and kind of had my kind of view of a piece tarnished by the way that it was ran, by the way I was treated running up to actually experiencing it, being ushered out, you know, kind of being whipped out before an experience is finished because they were running out of time. So I think it's important to consider those things for sure.
A great, inspiring presentation from a pioneer. Thank you.
Thank you.
We are thinking about having VR as part of a film festival near Berlin. And what was the best way to get hold of those Oculus Go, whatever, those goggles for such an occasion? So what would you recommend where to go to, and how many people would you recommend to have it in one session? So
I think in terms of the equipment, if it's kind of like a one-off event, if you can try and hire them in or kind of look for local companies in Berlin that own them that might give you a discounted rate, I would highly recommend that, because obviously to buy these Oculus Go's outright is obviously fairly expensive unless you're doing it enough for them to achieve an ROI. So try and do that. And then in terms of how many people, it depends on how many competent people you've got there to run it. I think it's really important that you don't have too many people so that if there's problems, you've got staff kind of running around, people waiting, you know, mine's frozen, mine's doing this. You need, again, coming back to that restaurant analogy, you need kind of, we've worked out kind of like one person per 5 maximum, really, one person to be able to look after 5 people at a time. And so I would say between 10 to 15 is like optimal, I think. I mean, 15 is probably a great sweet spot if you can find 15 headsets, but 10 works really well. And again, you know, kind of like we were saying about just making sure that that priming experience, that it is a kind of, you know, like it's kind of set up as more of like an event space rather than just kind of ushering people in and like whip you in and whip you out, kind of getting people in, getting them in the right kind of frame of mind. A lot of festivals do kind of strands that they curate. So you might go in for an hour and it's like 360 films back to back about a specific subject. That works really well. But yeah, definitely I would also recommend having someone like, you know, who kind of knows what they're talking about to be the one to like anchor that through, because again, festivals that have people that know nothing about VR hosting VR is quite, you know, they're not there to answer those questions, and people have a lot of questions, especially in a film festival where these are traditional filmmakers usually that want to know, hang on a second, this is amazing, how do I get into this? So having someone experienced running it is also a really good idea.
Hi, Alex. Looking at Phoenix, away from the festivals as an ongoing process, how integral is the speaker element of it, and are you finding that over time that's changing the importance of that part of what you're doing?
Yeah, it's interesting because I think ultimately I personally think that the discussion is kind of what brings people back, especially for that repeat audience. I think the fact that people know they're going to come see something different and then have a different conversation every time, that I believe is one of the main selling points. So I think it will be quite integral to what specifically the Phoenix want to do. And I think more and more it will be about kind of not just kind of having a talk about VR and the film they just watched, but also having the kind of creator come along and get to talk about their work and kind of making them integral to it. I think that's kind of how we're going to go. But, you know, my friend Catherine Allen just set up the UK's first VR-only theatre in Bristol, and she doesn't program like that. She programs films back to back, a bit like what I was saying about the strands. So, you know, you'll see 40 minutes back to back, and then you'll kind of like go to an area where you can have a conversation, but you don't have to. Now that model, way more scalable, doesn't require a person. So I guess it depends on what your aim is. She's found that that works really well and people enjoy it just as much. So I don't think there's a wrong answer. I think it's just all about who's that audience and, you know, what that area is likely to kind of like more, I guess. But both work.
Just to add on it, I think if you attach a bar to it, you make even more revenue.
Yeah. Yes. So true. Well, the beautiful thing about the Phoenix is it's a gorgeous independent cinema that has a giant kind of bar, kind of cafe area afterwards. So once we finish the kind of 40-minute discussion, it's kind of like, cool, let's continue this discussion with some beer. It's the best bit.
About licensing, just to have an idea, so say I create a documentary film, and I present it to you. In terms of licensing, how much would the revenues be? How much would I get paid to license it to you? What's the current stand of pricing?
Yeah, so at the moment, it's based on the traditional film model, which is not, you know, in arts, you get paid way more for you to have your piece licensed, like £250 plus. In the traditional cinema model, because they see it as short film, it's funded the same way. So license fees are around £75 to £100 for we did it per 2 shows. So because we were doing it kind of like 2 shows per kind of like film. It would be £75 per session, and then we would pay a speaker £100 plus their travel and accommodation and that kind of thing. So I think, again, if there was more of it and it was more permanent, so we were running it every month, but, you know, in future we might do it every week. All of a sudden, if you did like a week's worth of showings, and if we had 5 different cinemas all kind of doing it at the same time, that becomes fairly reasonable. If you're independent, of course. If you're working on like a 5-figure budget, you know, kind of high-end production, it might, you know, you're probably going to be looking to the telecoms and the big, you know, online distribution apps that can afford more. But I think where we are now, it's up to us. It's up to the indies to kind of push this forward, because, you know, if you start charging people £50 to come and see 360 film, you know, you're gonna ruin the industry essentially. But in order to keep that price low, you can't pay creators as much. So it's kind of, I think we're in this annoying position where we're kind of having to just like soldier on in there. But that's kind of what makes it fun, right? Having no money.
We're out of time for questions, I'm afraid. I'm really sorry about that. We have to move on to the next day, but thank you very, very much, Alex.
Thank you.